So a very warm welcome to you into this magnificent aula here at the Academy of Fine Arts. And it gives me special honor and great pleasure to introduce Professor Mary Sarotte, who is a professor at the Johns Hopkins University, Distinguished Professor of Historical Studies. She's also related to Harvard University's Center for European Studies, and she has published to great acclaim this book, Not 1 Inch, America and Russia, and I don't have the full title here, and the post-Cold War stalemate, and I'll ask you about that word stalemate a little later on. Mary Sarotte was on primetime TV last night, gave a big interview on ORF. She is all over the press this morning in Der Standard and the Presse. So those of you who read your real paper newspapers could see that this morning. So I think that's great recognition to the fact that this book that has been discussed already, it was published in 21, right, Mary?
Yes, this one 21, and it just came out in German.
And the German translation, which you see here, has just been published, and Mary Sarotte has very kindly agreed to sign copies of her books afterwards in the entrance hall. Now, by way of a briefest possible introduction, before we get into the nitty-gritty of things, is that, you know, we are in the depth of history here again. History has not only gone away, but it's back in full force. This is a very European story. It's about empires, territories, shifting borders. We know that, those of us who live in Europe, and Mary has tackled this question in a variety of ways. And I say that because, for example, today there are parliamentary elections in the first next-door neighbor of Austria and Slovakia, which is mostly about whether Slovakia continues to support the war effort of the Ukrainians or whether it pulls back from that. It's a battle between Robert Fico and Michal Šimečka, and we'll see the result this evening as we go into Michael Sandel's speech at the Volkstheater. Also, those of you who read Der Spiegel, there's a huge investigative article about Bucharest, April 2008, and I suggest that you read it along with Mary's book because it's a deep dive in a similar way, trawling documents and interviews, what happened in Bucharest and why did Angela Merkel actually push back on the possibility for Ukraine to become a NATO aspiring member with a membership action plan. This morning I was able to read it, and I think it has a lot of concomitance with what Mary's book is about. But also the fact that we have to remind ourselves, just in the briefest possible way, that in the period of the post-Second World War, the Soviet, you know, there's always this cliche that there's been peace in Europe for 70 years. Well, only in part of Europe, because the Soviet Union invaded Hungary in 1956, it invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, and I, who come from the former Yugoslavia that no longer exists, when I served my military service in 1972, we were ready to fight an invasion of the Soviets, and that's why they, I guess, never invaded, because they knew we would fight like the Ukrainians are fighting today. So there is a prehistory. And finally, I think, and this is something we'll discuss with Mary, Vladimir Putin gave a memorable or immemorable speech at the Munich Security Conference in February 2007, where he basically outlined the new Soviet policy. It was a stunning speech. Many were left speechless after that. Then we had this Bucharest summit in April of 2008, where Ukraine's membership was denied, basically. And then we had the invasion of Georgia by Russia in August 2008. And so there's a sequence of events here, of course, the annexation of Crimea in 14, and of course what happened on February 24th last year, which is some have called it the aftershock of 1989. Others have said that it's an event of equal importance because the Russian aggression, by most counts, was not expected. So maybe to start off with, Mary, from a personal point of view, were you expecting an invasion of Ukraine?
So first of all, I just want to say briefly thank you to IWM and thank you to all of you who are coming here today. Es freut mich riesig, hier zu sein. I have been really flattered by the level of interest that there has been in my book, and I'm really grateful that you're taking time on a beautiful Saturday to come talk in a serious way about these issues that are so important right now. I have had a very strange couple of years, obviously not nearly as strange as the Ukrainians, and I would like to express my profound admiration for the Ukrainians. I think you're 100% right when you say, you know, the way they've pushed back is really fundamental in this war. For me, the invasion, as I said, was a very strange experience because I was working on this book, not 1 inch. I actually started work on it in 2005. So I've been working on this book for close to 20 years. Obviously, I've been doing other things. I'm a professor at Hopkins. I was teaching and working on other books. But what had happened is that I had started in my earlier research to find documents related to NATO enlargement. Now, the reason I was researching in that area comes from the fact that in the year 1989, I was studying abroad in West Berlin. And so that was obviously the year that shaped my life, and I decided to become a historian, to get my PhD at Yale, and to go on to write about the end of the Cold War. And I was working in the late 1990s, early 2000s on books on the wall coming down, that's called The Collapse, and on the foreign policy of German unification, that's called 1989. And as I was working on those books, I kept finding evidence about NATO enlargement, which at the time was a surprise, because at the time people said it's, you know, only happening in the mid-1990s. And I just was seeing all this evidence making clear that was not the case. It was very closely tied up to the fall of the wall and German unification. So I thought, okay, I'm going to start trying to declassify more of this evidence. And I filed declassification requests over the past 20 years in the US, in Britain, in France, in Germany. I also went and worked in Russia and Poland, where they don't have the same kind of declassification. But I got sources from all these countries, and I did more than 100 interviews. I figured, though, that I didn't want to publish the book until I had enough evidence, because there's too many books about this topic that are based on suppositions or emotions. There's a lot of personal accounts which are useful because, you know, they're important, but they're very much colored by a person's experience. I wanted to write an academic book based on evidence. I took no part in these negotiations. Nothing in these books is from my memory. Everything in these books is keyed to a source, and in the English edition, the footnotes are nearly 200 pages long as a result. So all of this is by way of background to answering your question. So I was in this decades-long process of getting sources declassified. I did not want to write the book too soon, but in 2018, I had a particular breakthrough, which is that I got nearly all of the documents from summits between American President Bill Clinton and Russian President Boris Yeltsin declassified after a 3-year appeal. And when I won my 3-year appeal, the Kremlin complained. Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, protested the fact that I had received these documents. He said the library should have consulted with us because there are currently serving politicians in these documents. And by that, he meant his boss, Vladimir Putin, who is all over these documents because he was working for Boris Yeltsin. So I figured, wow, if the Kremlin is complaining, this evidence must be good. And it was. And in fact, it's so good that together with the Clinton Library, I've put it online. So if you would like to see what I got declassified, you can literally, right now while you're sitting here, Google Clinton Library and Google Clinton and Yeltsin, and you'll see this evidence. Because again, it was important to me that this be an academic book, which means reproducible, right? Everything in this book is reproducible. You may not agree with my interpretation, but if I say, you know, there's a document here, a description of a conversation between the American Secretary of State James Baker and the last General Secretary of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, and it's in the Bush Presidential Library, and it's in box 10, folder 3. Again, you may not agree with my interpretation, but that document is in the library, in box 10, in folder 3, and you could go look at it or pull it up online, and it will say what I say it says. So it was so important to me that everything in this book be reproducible that I decided I would not even quote from my interviews, because somebody interviewing someone after me could maybe get a different answer. So long-winded introduction to come to your question. So finally, late 2018, 2019, I thought, I have enough evidence. It's time to write the book. And as I started, and so then the question was, when am I going to publish it? And as I started looking at the evidence, it became clear to me as a historian, this is the power of the historical method, that Putin likes to celebrate birthdays and anniversaries with violence, both real bloodshed and cyber. So for example, the incredibly brave human rights activist Anna Politkovskaya, a journalist who was one of the few who was brave enough to go into the brutal Chechen war sites and report on the war crimes being committed there, which sadly we now know are a precursor to Mariupol, to Bucha, and to all of the horrible war crimes we're seeing today. She was back home carrying home groceries, small, petite, middle-aged woman, shot dead multiple times at close range, obviously by a professional killer. The day that happened, October 7th, 2006, Putin's birthday. Fast forward 10 years, the day that the emails hacked from the Hillary Clinton campaign from John Podesta's computer, the day they dropped online, October 7th, 2016. Putin's birthday. I could give you a list of things that have happened on October 7th. For his 70th birthday last year, Putin tried to gift himself 40,000 square miles of Ukraine by announcing he was annexing the territory, even though the Russian troops did not then and did not now control it. So it became clear to me that Putin liked to celebrate birthdays and anniversaries with violence. I have no idea if he personally gives orders or if he just says to people around him, you know what would be nice? Right? But it's clear that bad things happen on anniversaries. And as I was looking at the calendar, I realized, my God, in December 2021 is the 30th anniversary of Ukraine pulling away from Moscow. And I thought, you know, I don't know what's going to happen, right? I wasn't, you know, psychic. I didn't know he would try to take Kyiv in 3 days. But I was certain that that the chances he could ignore that date, the chances that Putin would ignore the 30th anniversary were 0. I was certain something would happen. So I decided to publish my book in America in December 2021 and in Britain in February 2022. Now, when you're publishing an academic book, it's in press for close to a year. So when my book went to press at the beginning of 2021, I thought, all right, let me try to sound an alarm sooner. So in the fall of 2021, I tried to place an op-ed, an article, with the title, Deadly Anniversary of a Divorce. And the punchline of this article was, 30 years after the bitter divorce between Moscow and Ukraine, Putin is acting like a bitter ex who's willing to use violence to get back what he thinks is his. This op-ed was turned down by every important publication in the English-speaking world. So I still have all of these emails, and after a while it got to be so depressing I just stopped sending this article out because I knew the book was going to appear. Fast forward to February 24th, 2022, so this is to answer your question. Absolutely. And I was deeply saddened and indeed grieved at the extent of what was happening, but I was not surprised. And then all of a sudden my email inbox exploded, my phone started ringing. Did we say no to your article? That was a misunderstanding. We meant yes. Can we publish it right now, right? And so if you Google my name, you'll see how many articles I ended up publishing afterwards. So long-winded answer, but to help set the stage. I say this not to say that, you know, I was psychic. Again, I didn't know he was going to try to take Kyiv in 3 days. I say this to show the power of history as a method, not only for understanding the past, but also for understanding the future, right? Because detailed historical study helps us to recognize patterns. And it doesn't mean we can exactly predict what is going to happen, but it does mean we can prepare. So again, I'm really grateful to you for taking time on a beautiful Saturday to come talk about history, because I think it's the best way possible to prepare yourself for what's coming. And I think we have some rough years ahead of us.
Mary, thank you very much for taking us back to the origins of the book and your experience of 1989 in Germany and the reunification. I think it helps for the further conversation, but also thank you for explaining, and those of us who have read the book and the interviews, we know how much work went into this. And again, you highlighted the fact that there's a very meticulous, determined and committed engagement to actually set the scene based on documents and not on hearsay. Let me try and go back to this issue. How did Russia shift from a Yeltsin wanting to join NATO and hail Partnership for Peace as a first step, and then also Putin in the early 2000s talking about, you know, coming close to NATO and even maybe contemplating the idea of it. What happened? What is the shift that occurs in Russia? Because obviously you've looked closely at them as well. We'll come back to actually the Western approach to the enlargement.
Yeah, also, and not just Yeltsin and Putin, but also Gorbachev was interested in joining NATO. Again, this issue came up right away. It makes sense when you think about it, because behind the scenes, as soon as the wall came down, you know, if you were in charge of a country or a foreign ministry or a military or a major business, immediately you're thinking, what comes next, right? And so, you know, there were big questions about, what does this mean for the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe? What does this mean for, you know, market economies? What does this mean for democracies? I always like to cite this because it's been forgotten. The date on which Hungary applied for European community membership, so that's a hint, European community, not European Union.
Right.
The Hungarian foreign minister showed up in person to submit the application, was received with a standing ovation. The date this happened was November 16th, 1989. Hungary applied for European community membership 1 week after the wall came down. And at that point added, which I actually found was kind of ironic, the Hungarians said, please don't hold it against us that we're members of the Warsaw Pact, because we don't want to pull out of that yet, because that would destroy Gorbachev. And everything is going so well for us under Gorbachev, we don't want to undermine him, not until we get the Soviet troops out. But as long as, you know, you all understand, we're going to pull out of the Warsaw Pact as soon as we've gotten what we need and get into NATO, that'll be fine. A week later, American President George H.W. Bush and Margaret Thatcher, this is November 24th, 1989, had a phone call where Bush said to Thatcher, you know, the East Europeans are going to want to leave the Warsaw Pact, so NATO's got to stay, right? By a few months later, Gorbachev was saying, the last leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, was saying to the American Secretary of State, James Baker, how about we merge NATO and the Warsaw Pact? And James Baker said, well, I can't really see how that would work. And then Gorbachev said, well, how about the Soviet Union joins NATO? And Baker said, well, that's a fantasy. And Gorbachev said, that's not a fantasy. We were allies. We defeated Nazi Germany together. Why can't we be allies again? So just a long-winded way to say this question of Russia being in NATO pops up early and then continues under Yeltsin and Putin. But then, of course, you know, things go horribly wrong, right? And that's in large part what the book is about, is the way the relationship declines and creates, instead of, you know, this future of cooperation, this post-Cold War period of stalemate and then war. As I was working on this book, I sort of, just kind of step back for a minute. As I was working on this book, I had the good fortune that my previous book on the wall coming down was optioned for production as a limited TV series. Along the lines of Chernobyl, like a 5-part TV series. And now that doesn't mean it's definitely going to be a TV series, so I'm not buying the beach house yet. But it does mean that instead of a 1 in a billion chance of my books becoming a television show, there's maybe a 1 in a 10,000 chance, right? And what it really meant is that I started spending time with a screenwriter who's now written the first episode of what the TV series will be when it's actually produced. And I realized, talking to the screenwriter, that he and I had something in common, which is we are both writers. But the difference is that I get a paycheck from Johns Hopkins University. So if, you know, my books don't sell, I can still turn the lights on and eat breakfast at home. Whereas he has to live from selling his writing. And he gave me a piece of advice that actually relates to your question. He said, you know, when I'm trying to sell a script, I don't actually start with the details. I actually start with the emotional core. You know, I just say something like, this is a show about white-collar crime coming home. And immediately you can see it's about a family and what it means and so forth. And he said, how would you describe what you do? You know, I started thinking for myself, how would I describe the emotional core of what I do? Because I've got these books here, hundreds of pages of diplomatic documents, right? And I thought, wow, if I step back from the details, if I get out behind this protective wall of sources, what is my book about? What is the emotional image of my book? And I decided it was the following. So imagine in the ocean, you're swimming, you've been carried out by a riptide, and you manage to grab onto a log that you think will be your safety. My book is about the moment that salvation slips away. So this is about the moment when there was a thaw in the strategic nuclear competition between Moscow and Washington. That's one that continues till today. More than 30 years after the end of the Cold War, Moscow and Washington still control 90% of the world's nuclear warheads. They are still the only two countries that within minutes can end civilization on Earth, right? That's why I thought this story was important enough to devote 2 decades of my life to studying it. And, you know, Cold Wars are not short-lived affairs, so thaws are precious. And this is a book about how neither we in the West nor the Russians took the best advantage of the thaw that we had. And so to circle back to your question, there are really serious self-harming errors made by Yeltsin, right? He becomes the first democratic leader in Russian history. He starts to institute a democracy, but then very quickly he falls back on violence. So when he has a dispute with his parliament in October 1993, his response is to order tanks to fire on the parliament. This was a major event that we, I think, did not process fully in the West. He ordered tanks to fire on his own parliament. 100 people died. 800 people were injured. Parliament ceased to function. It was the greatest bloodshed in the heart of Moscow since the 1917 revolution, because, of course, the Nazis didn't get to the heart of Moscow.
Right.
And then, even worse, in 1994, Yeltsin started the war in Chechnya, which became a truly brutal exercise in destroying cities. Grozny became the most destroyed city in Europe. Of course, now there's competition for that title. So it was really Yeltsin's decisions, and then, of course, his decision to pluck Putin more or less out of obscurity, have Putin make the Chechen war even more brutal in the late 90s, and then promote Putin to acting president. All of those decisions together helped undermine the willingness of the West, quite understandably, to cooperate with Moscow. But that is really a tragedy, because before that happened, there had been the greatest moment of nuclear disarmament ever. At the beginning of the 1980s, Washington and Moscow worked hand in hand to not just dismantle, not just take offline, but to destroy strategic nuclear weapons. It was the greatest moment of disarmament since the dawn of the atomic age. It was a great moment of improving the safety, not just of Russia and the United States, but of the whole planet.
A huge diplomatic
success.
A
huge diplomatic success, and that diplomacy fell apart. So again, long-winded answer, but these are great questions, really meaty ones, and that's what I think that went wrong in Russia.
So maybe this is a vacuous question, but was it wrong for Ukraine to disarm nuclearly and sign
No, that's not a vacuous question.
Budapest
That's an important question. So for context, Ukraine became independent, as I mentioned, in December 1991. It pulled away from Moscow. It held an election and a referendum in December 1991. International observers declared that election free and fair. And an overwhelming majority of Ukrainians voted to become independent. It was certainly over 80%. I'm trying to remember if it was over 90%, but it was in that range. And in all districts of Ukraine, everywhere, including Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, there was an absolute majority, more than 50% of people voting for independence. So this was a democratically legitimized independence movement. And when it became independent in December 1991, Ukraine was immediately the third biggest nuclear power in the world, because of the amount of nuclear arsenal on its territory. Now, to be clear, that was former Soviet arsenal, and command and control was set up for Washington. But Ukraine possessed some of the finest engineers in the world, and Ukraine had long been the home of this nuclear arsenal, and it was not unthinkable that Ukrainian engineers could, reprogram these missiles. There were 1,250 of them roughly, all of them targeting the United States. Among other consequences, this caused the American Secretary of State, James Baker, to drop everything and fly to Ukraine shortly before Christmas to say, could you please tell me who exactly has the ability to kill nearly all of the people who live in my country? Because if 1,250 nuclear weapons had suddenly, been out of control, they were pre-targeted to hit American cities. When he came home from that, Baker said to his boss, President George H.W. Bush, also his old friend and tennis partner, he said this privately, not publicly. He said, George, this is the biggest foreign policy problem facing the United States. We don't know who is controlling these nuclear weapons, really. We also don't know about the ones in Belarus or the ones in Kazakhstan. These would come to be called loose nukes. And Baker would focus on his efforts to figure out who was in control of them. So to come to your question, President Bush then loses the 1992 presidential election in the United States, which is a shock, right? It was a profound shock to Baker. Baker couldn't believe it. He said, I'm busy trying to figure out what to do with these loose nukes, and now we're being kicked out of office. So as, the Clinton-Bush team was leaving, they impressed on the Clinton team how important it was to pay attention to these loose nukes. And the result ultimately was the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. The Budapest Memorandum of 1994. In that memorandum, Ukraine agreed to either dismantle or move to Russia the nuclear weapons it had inherited. And there was a huge debate, and I discuss this in the book, I have some of the Ukrainian documents on this, a huge debate in Ukraine about whether to keep those weapons or not. And eventually what happened was just sheer brutal economic pressure. Ukraine became economic, and its economy was in free fall. The statistics made the American Great Depression look like a picnic. There was real hunger. There was starvation. There were people picking through trash cans for food. There were children being abandoned in railroad stations. Some of the documents I got declassified were the U.S. Embassy reports back to Washington about just how horrific life was becoming in Ukraine. Embassy staff reported people in stores sobbing when they realized they couldn't even afford, butter or sour cream. And so basically the Western countries, which wanted Ukraine to denuclearize, the Western countries behind the scenes basically said to Ukraine, you have a choice. You can either get help from us so your people can actually eat and survive, or you can keep your nuclear weapons and be North Korea. The choice is yours. And so the Ukrainians decided, they said, well, okay, we clearly need economic help. We clearly want your support. But could we at least, have some kind of agreement about our safety if we give up these weapons? As I was reading this, I was basically falling out of my chair at how pressing it was. The Ukrainian diplomats were saying, look, Russia is going to attack us. We just need some kind of something from the West.
They use those words? Russia's going to attack?
Yes, this is in the book, yeah. We know that this is not going to protect us from Russia attacking us. But we want some kind of automatic response or forum or something when it happens. And they tried hard to get guarantees from the West in exchange for giving up their nuclear weapons. And instead, they got assurances. Now, that might seem like a minor difference, but it's not. A guarantee is like Article 5 of the NATO treaty. Right? That's a guarantee that every member state will regard an attack on one as an attack on all. Put in blunt terms, if you have a guarantee, your chances are good that the 82nd Airborne is coming to help you. If you have an assurance, you do not have that backup. Right? So Ukraine could only get assurances.
And that was the Budapest.
And that was the Budapest Memorandum. But they did at least get Russia's signature. So Russia assured Ukrainian territorial integrity with its signature on that.
Time is running very fast.
Sorry.
And we have so much to discuss.
Sorry.
I'd like to take you to this issue.
Yeah.
NATO enlargement imposed on these countries, which again, the Lavrovs of these world constantly, spewed out, these poor countries are being made because of economic and other issues to join this club versus, of course, the desire of all of these countries, including countries in the Western Balkans who say, look, Russia's a danger for us. We were part of the Warsaw Pact. The Cold War, took us away. We were grabbed and put behind an iron curtain. We want to be protected by a NATO umbrella or canopy, whichever metaphor we want to use. And I'll just state the example of North Macedonia, for example. Lavrov said, if Macedonia joins NATO, my goodness, you'll see what will happen. Of course, nothing happened. Macedonia and Montenegro and Albania joined. So if you could give us kind of the two sides of the story, because I know you address this issue in the book as well.
Yeah, so to be clear, I am not opposed to NATO enlargement. I think NATO enlargement made sense. I think the countries that became NATO members, they were new democracies. They had a right to self-determination. According to the Helsinki Final Act of the CACE, which Moscow signed,
free choice.
Countries have the right to choose their own security alliances. I think that makes sense. NATO also had the right to accept their application and take them on. My criticism is not with NATO enlargement itself, but with how it happened. So one of the big surprises of my research was just how vigorous and heated the debate was over how to expand NATO. And that's gotten forgotten, I think. President Clinton back then used to say, it's not just a question of whether or when, but also how. And supporters of enlargement would say, oh, it's not a question of whether or when, great. And he would say, no, it's not a question, it's a question of whether, when, and how. And he kept repeating that. And so in my book, I'm trying to bring the how back into the discussion. So what happens is that President Clinton initially, and I was really amazed when I read this in the documents because I thought this was really prescient. They quoted me in the press today saying I nearly fell out of my chair as I read this. Back in the early 1990s, President Clinton said, we've just erased the Cold War line through Europe. Why should we now draw a new Article 5 line? In other words, the countries that have Article 5, that's the heart of the NATO treaty. That's the promise that an attack on one, the guarantee that an attack on one will be treated as an attack on all. If we just give Article 5 to Poland and Hungary and a few other countries, we're going to draw a new line between Article 5 territory and non-Article 5 territory, and we are going to leave Ukraine in the lurch. I'm paraphrasing here, but this is all in the book. And peace in Ukraine, peace in Europe depends to a large measure on Ukraine. And I'm like, oh my God, right? I'm reading this from the 1990s. And so initially, when the Poles and Hungarians came to him and saying, we want to be in NATO yesterday, he said, I understand that, but you of all countries should understand what it means if we draw a line and leave countries on the far side of it. And we're going to leave Ukraine alone with Russia. So we're going to have to think of a different way to enlarge NATO. So this is how we're going to do it. He developed this together with his defense minister, Bill Perry, who I think is a very smart man. He said, we're going to intentionally inject some ambiguity into this process, right? This will help Russia to save face, and this will allow us to give Ukraine a place in a European security order. So what we're going to do is we're going to create something called the Partnership for Peace, and this is going to be the manner of enlarging NATO. It'll be a kind of intermediate waiting room. We'll have countries join it, not only you, Poland and Hungary, but also post-Soviet states. And then you can use the time in the Partnership for Peace to become interoperable with NATO, because the Warsaw Pact countries were not interoperable with NATO. Their radios didn't work, the gas stations, the nozzles were the wrong size to fuel things up. There was a whole bunch that needed to happen. So what we'll do is inside the Partnership for Peace, on the surface we'll say everybody is equal, but as it really works out, what we'll do is there'll be certain countries that will become members more quickly. But that will allow us to keep Russia going with disarmament, because it'll allow Russia to save face, which regardless of what you think of the Russians, it's good to keep disarmament going. And that'll allow us to give Ukraine a berth in a security order that's not quite NATO. And then what will happen is if there's a real crisis, we can have a bunch of countries that we can get them almost up to the level to be NATO members in terms of interoperability. And if there's a real crisis, they can become members within weeks. And by the way, this worked. This is exactly what happened with Finland. Finland joined Partnership for Peace, spent decades becoming interoperable, and once it made the decision to join, it was ready. If Turkey hadn't delayed it, Finland would have been a member within weeks. So that was, I think, a good idea as the way of expanding NATO, and I praise that in the book. But then several things caused Clinton to change his mind. The first we've already discussed, and the first and by far most important is that in Moscow there's bloodshed again as a means of politics. That causes all the Central and Eastern Europeans to say roughly, okay, we understood what you said about Ukraine, but Moscow is killing people again. So it's kind of too bad about Ukraine, but we really need Article 5. And then there's also domestic pressures. In 1994, in the fall of 1994, there's a midterm congressional election in the United States, which the Republican Party wins in dramatic fashion. They take back the House and the Senate for the first time in 30 years. And they do this on the basis of something called the Contract with America, which includes a plank saying, expand NATO, give people Article 5 as fast as possible. And Clinton seized that victory. He said, I almost felt like I died when that happened because I realized, that was a big risk to my reelection. I'm going to need those voters for my reelection. I need to rethink this NATO issue, among other things. And then Ukraine denuclearizes in 1994, so suddenly it's less important if you leave Ukraine in the lurch. So all of these things come together, and President Clinton changes his mind under this pressure from the Central and Eastern European states, bloodshed in Moscow, domestic pressures, and he says, you know what? Let's draw that Article 5 line across Europe. Again, I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he does. And so that's how NATO enlargement happens. And that's my criticism, is that this manner of enlargement was the one that people, even at the time, knew would leave Ukraine in the lurch. Just one concluding word on that. Basically, the big play at the end of the Cold War of German Der große Wurf was to do three things. It was to help these new democracies in Central and Eastern Europe, become independent and join NATO. It was to define a place for Ukraine in Europe, right? Ukraine at that point was a state of 50 million people. It is a major European state. And to keep relations with Russia going. So the challenge was to square that circle, to keep good relations with Central and Eastern Europe, with Ukraine and with Russia. That's actually, if you think about it, three locations. That's not a circle, that's a triangle with 3 points: Central and Eastern Europe, Ukraine, and Russia. So in reality, I realized what we needed to do was square the triangle. And unlike circles, triangles can be squared. And I think the Partnership for Peace was a way to square the triangle. But instead, only one of those things happened. Only Central and Eastern Europe got into NATO, which is good, but we did not define a place for Ukraine, and we did not keep good relations with Russia going, and we are paying the price for that today.
So, as Ukraine is left basically in this no man's land,
yes,
given the situation, that goes back to the decision in April 2008 when Chancellor Merkel takes the lead, but as we know, many countries are behind her. Even the Brits are wavering there and are not holding Bush's line about it being there. I was actually present there. We had a think tank summit along with the NATO summit. And I remember how dramatic it was waiting for the white or the black smoke to come out. But this question of the fact that the Central and East European countries joined, they feel safe. They are constantly warning, and that comes out again. The Poles and the Baltic states are saying, everyone be wary because we know that this might be coming. And then, of course, we have the invasion of the little green men in 2014. But Germany, surprisingly, starts a project called Nord Stream 2.
Continues a project.
Continues with a second pipeline, hope against hope. Whatever the German expression is, Handel zum Wandel. And what is the thinking there? Is Merkel at one point says, well, Putin lives in a different world. I mean, how do you square that? Why is she oblivious? I mean, with hindsight, we see that was actually a mistake, believing that you could bring Russia through, in Montesquieu's famous words, les doux effets du commerce, the soothing effects of commerce.
Yeah, so again, as a historian, I always think of things in context. And again, another one of the surprises in my research is that the question of Ukrainian membership in NATO did not originate in 2008, which is a slightly mistaken impression left by that article. So this is one of the challenges. That article is useful, but it's based mainly on interviews. The magazine did not get the classified document. So they did not get the kind of thing that I use for my book. They did it basically on memories, which are important, but human memories has its limits as well. So what I was amazed by when I looked at my sources is that this question of Ukraine joining NATO did not just originate in 2008, but actually originated in the early 1990s. In fact, the National Security Advisor under Clinton, Tony Lake, wrote a memo to Clinton, which I cite in the book, where he said, you know, we're going to need to put not just Central and Eastern Europe, but also the Baltics and Ukraine in NATO. And President Clinton put a big left-handed check mark on it. He was left-handed and wrote, looks good. And again, you don't have to take my word for it. This is on the Clinton Library website. And so this discussion about Ukraine being in NATO started early on. And then it caused this discussion about, wow, we really need to think carefully about how we expand NATO. Because if we just, you know, give Ukraine Article 5, that's a big red flag to Russia, right? I'm not agreeing with it, but there is this Russian view that, you know, there's historical unity and history started there. Again, I'm not agreeing with it, but I'm just citing it. And so there was this sense of, okay, well, if we're going to talk about putting the Baltics and Ukraine in NATO, and again, this is confidential discussion, 93, 94, 95. Strobe Talbot in particular was adamant that NATO enlargement could not end until the Baltics were indefinitely, and maybe Ukraine as well. But then people said, well, if we really give Article 5 to Ukraine, first, that's a huge responsibility to take on. NATO operates by unanimous agreement, so would all countries agree to it or not? Hard to say. That's why we need something like the Partnership for Peace. It helps us to manage contingency. We can give Ukraine a space that's close to NATO, and if something happens, we have some leverage then because we could advance it along the process of NATO membership. That would be nice to have now, that ability to manage contingency, because all we've got now is to give Ukraine Article 5 or not. So this issue about whether to put Ukraine in didn't originate in 2008. As I described, it was a big part of the consideration of the Partnership for Peace. But then once Clinton rethinks, once Yeltsin starts shedding blood, there's kind of this sense of, oh, we'll leave Ukraine in the lurch. So that means you had this, you know, really difficult issue that had just been kicked forward to the future. And then when you get to 2008, it's really hard to solve. It's a really, really difficult issue. And the 2008 summit, as you know, the Bucharest summit, really produced a worst of all worlds compromise, where it issued a declaration saying, quote, Ukraine and Georgia will become members, but with no date, no actual plan for it to happen. So that had the terrible effect that on the one hand, it arose expectations, understandably. It produced expectations in Georgia and Ukraine that they would become members, and those proved to be false hopes. But also it enraged Putin, who then used an excuse conveniently provided by the Georgians to start the Georgian war and really started us on this negative spiral that we're on now. And then, of course, you have the separate issue of the Germans. The phrase he was using, Handel durch Handel, is a German phrase meaning you try to change dictatorial states by trading with them. That was very much a tenet of German policy, you know, going back into the Cold War and forward. Again, not just Merkel. So I guess I'm kind of pushing back on this idea that it's a unique problem to Merkel and that somehow she was personally oblivious and everybody else in Germany knew what was going on. No, I don't agree with that.
The tip of the iceberg.
So I think that there's this, you know, broader issue. And that was why the start of the war in many ways was particularly wrenching in Germany. Now, obviously it was, again, I cannot say this enough, the people who are really suffering are the Ukrainians. So everything I'm saying about, you know, other people going through a wrenching experience is as contrasted with them. But it was a wrenching experience in Germany because this belief in Wandel durch Handel, change through trade, is a real core belief for decades, and now the Germans are finally backing off of it. And that is a really painful process in Germany, to give up a belief that you've followed for decades.
So before I open it for a few questions, the final question for me, clearly there's an influential body of expert opinion that argues that NATO enlargement was the cause of this Russian aggression.
The John Mearsheimer argument.
Yeah, I mean, George Kennan already in the 1990s warned about this, you know, at the other end, Charlie Kupchan, for example, with whom you discussed these issues, warned while he was at the White House. Where do you come down on that?
Well, as I said, I don't think, I mean, Putin has been using this as a justification for what he's done in Ukraine. Simply put, there is no justification for war crimes, right? There is no justification for bombing maternity wards, right? So even, totally apart from, the details of NATO expansion, and I'm happy to talk about them until everyone in the room loses the will to live, right? We need to do a moral reality check, right? There is no justification for what is happening today in Ukraine. I mean, in a certain sense, one of the reasons I'm here, and I'm glad that you joined me here today, is I profoundly wish that Russians would put down their weapons and go home, and that the killing would stop. That is not going to happen. I cannot make it happen. But Putin is also using history as a weapon. He's using these events that we're talking about now as a justification, as a tool, to try to convince people that somehow what he's doing is right. And there I can actually help. To my amazement, I've been working for 2 decades on a sequence of events that obsesses Vladimir Putin. As far as I can tell, he had the worst COVID work-from-home experience ever. He sat home and obsessed about all the times in history that he thought Russia lost, and he wants to roll history back and play it again, only with Russia winning. And in particular, one of the things he wants to roll back to is conversations about whether or not NATO would move not 1 inch to the east, which I do describe in detail in my book, right? I published my book, as I said, the American edition, in December 2021, and 2 weeks later he gave a press conference where he kept saying over and over again, not 1 inch, not 1 inch, not 1 inch, right? They betrayed us, absolutely. And I can say as a historian, no, that's not accurate. There is a treaty on German unification that makes it clear NATO can enlarge. And Moscow not only signed that treaty, not only ratified it, but cashed the associated check. Right? And this is something that Putin ignores. So it's a very minor contribution compared to what the Ukrainians are experiencing, but I feel like it's a way I can help disarm Putin, right, and take this historical weapon away from him. So that's why when I get an opportunity to talk to an audience such as you and actually talk to you in detail about what's happening, I'm really grateful and I say yes, because I feel like it's a small way that, we can help to disarm this historical weapon.
Absolutely. So I'll open it up to the floor and questions. I see one there. I'll take 3 questions and we'll package them. First here in the front. Do we need a mic? Yeah, we need a microphone, please.
Good. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. Wonderful. And
please
I'm sure going
yourself.
to. Is it not on?
No, please say who you are.
Oh, well, see. Is that all right now?
It's all right, but introduce yourself.
Oh, introduce myself. Oh, yes. I'm sorry about that. Yes, my name is Andreas Verludi. I am actually a retired Professor Emeritus of Spatial Planning and European Spatial Planning from Delft University of Technology, but I'm actually a born Central European, born in Budapest and grown up here. Well, my question is actually about Poland. You didn't mention Poland, and Poland an implacable enemy of Russia. And presently, of course, at the forefront of the conflagration. And I'm just wondering whether Poland plays any role in your story. Especially since Poland, of course, owned half of Ukraine. I mean, the whole west of Ukraine was Polish, including parts of Belarus. So where is Poland in this particular story?
Now, do you want me to answer, or do you want to collect the question?
I'll pick 3 questions because time is, well, right here in front, and then we'll go to the back.
Krauchmark, Institute of the Regions of Europe. The talk in general, isn't it a little bit wrong insofar as all these new members of NATO, they just want to protect themselves. None of them want to attack Russia, and it should be more emphasized probably.
Okay, and then right at the back. Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Kanishka Ghorsdastidar. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Passau in Germany. And my question also relates to this sort of emotional core. So something I thought about is the notion of neutrality and whether it is more precarious than it actually offering a sense of security, and whether, for example, the historical context of Belgium in World War II or this notion of neutrality for Ukraine now, or even countries like Austria, whether that actually hurts more than it helps.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Great,
Back
thank you
to
so
you,
much.
Mary.
Okay, great. All right, so yeah, thank you for those great questions. So Andreas, can I call you Andreas? Thank you for your question. Maybe just because, I'm speaking English and quickly, I did talk about Poland, and Poland does appear in the book. So for example, I was saying before, President Clinton, when he was trying to decide how to enlarge NATO, he was speaking with the Poles, because the Poles were saying, as I mentioned, we really want to be in NATO, and President Clinton said to the Poles, I understand that, and you are going to get in NATO, but if we just give you Article 5, we're going to draw a new line through Europe, and we're going to leave Ukraine on the far side of that line. And you Poles, above all people, should understand what it means if we in the West draw a line and we leave a country on the wrong side of it, because we did that to you at Yalta. Now, the Polish president, Lech Walesa, he did not like that. There was a lot of yelling and screaming, but eventually he came around to and he said, okay, we see the point, we don't like it, but we see the point, what do you want us to do? And Clinton said, we want you to join the Partnership for Peace. Don't worry, it's the path to NATO expansion. To a large extent, as I argue in the book, NATO expansion is about Poland. So Poland plays a central role in the book. In fact, when they designed the cover, it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see it over there. When they designed the cover, there's actually a map in light text, and the word Poland actually appears right here. So it's hard to see, you can't see it at this scale, but you can see it when you look at the book. So Poland is at the core of the book. In fact, when I started writing the book, I thought I was largely going to be writing a book about Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. What shocked me was the extent to which I was writing a book about Ukraine. That I did not expect. And, the feeling just got more and more surreal as it, Putin started to amass a killing force on the borders of Ukraine. So absolutely Poland plays a huge role in this. And then what happens is when Yeltsin starts to use bloodshed, when he attacks his own parliament, when he starts the Chechen war, it's Warsaw along with Prague and Budapest that go to Clinton and say, no, we agree to the Partnership for Peace, but now we've seen this movie before with Russia. And so, sorry about the Ukrainians, but we need Article 5. None of this Partnership for Peace nonsense. And it comes together with the Republican midterm congressional elections and the denuclearization of Ukraine. And suddenly, and then there's a bunch of people saying, we really don't need to worry about Ukraine. And Clinton finally says, okay, he changes his mind. That, I think, was a mistake. That, I think, it was the moment where the big play, the squaring of the triangle, slipped away. Then on your question, you're saying new members aren't willing to attack Russia.
They just need protection.
NATO is not going to attack Russia. NATO is not an offensive alliance. It is not a requirement of members. In fact, it actually is a barrier to membership if you are currently in a war. NATO is not designed to attack Russia. It's actually a problem now because, in strictly speaking military terms, NATO planned to defend Western Europe from an advancing Russian army, and that's the military training that it had. And now the Ukrainians are working with, NATO trainers, and they're actually having to figure out how you push forward into fixed defensive Russian positions, right? How you attack a trench. And the problem is that NATO didn't plan to do that. NATO wasn't going to attack Russia. NATO wasn't going to push forward through fixed Russian positions. It was going to defend Western Europe from the Soviets coming forward. And so all the planning was, how do you defend against an invading army, not how do you go forward into fixed positions. I mean, they just did a technical level, right? How do you, take a trench at a very, at a tactical level? That's not really something that the West was planning to do. So you're right, these new members are not planning on attacking Russia, but that's accurate because NATO does not exist to attack Russia. Again, something that Putin says that is not accurate, right? So Putin has this myth that somehow, NATO was trying to gear up for this big attack of Russia, which it was not. And then finally, to come to the question at the back from the University of Passau, I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear your name, but that's a terrific question about neutrality. It's a terrific question here in Austria. So it's an interesting experience for me to be here. Basically, 10 days after Finland announced it was going to join NATO, I found myself inside the presidential palace doing a briefing in one of those rooms where you have to leave all your electronics outside, right? And all the curtains are shut, even though, it would have been nice to have them open, because the hope is that it's not, able to be penetrated by Russian intelligence. And basically in Finland, they wanted a crash course on NATO enlargement, the history of which I work on, for better or worse, since 2 decades. I then had to go to Sweden, do a crash course on the history of NATO intelligence. I've done briefings in multiple countries. Again, this is all for me kind of surreal. Like 4 years ago, when people would ask me, what are you working on? I'd say, well, I'm still working on my NATO book. And people would look at me and say, sometimes more politely, sometimes less politely, you seem like a smart lady. Why are you working on such a brain-dead topic? No one cares about NATO, no one cares about Russia, no one cares about military issues. That's all belongs to the past. And I would try to say, there's still only 2 places in the world that can end life on Earth. That kind of seems important to me. And understanding the disintegration in their relationship seems to me like the fundamental tragedy of our time. So that's why I'm spending, 2 decades of my life working on this. So the interesting thing is I was in Finland, and this is a country that decided to abandon neutrality. So now I come here to Austria, and I saw some colleagues at the Diplomatic Academy, and they said the response here was to double down on neutrality. But I think that your point is a good one, which is neutrality is, it can give a false sense of safety. And neutrality is a tricky position. I mean, what does it mean to say you're neutral but be a member of the European Union, right? So I think there's a lot of ambiguity involved in neutrality. What's particularly dangerous is the kind of neutrality the kind of stance in which we left Georgia and Ukraine. So when NATO said in 2008, Georgia and Ukraine will become members, that's a direct quote, will become members, we actually put them in a very dangerous position. Because on the one hand, we didn't actually make them members, we didn't give them Article 5, we didn't, send forces there, but we waved a red flag at Putin, right? And he said, oh my God, well, I know that the NATO treaty does not allow countries engaged in conflict to become members. So I can create one of those. I can create a conflict. I can block them from being members, right? So actually the most dangerous position is if you're neutral but close to NATO, which pretty much describes Austria, right? So I think you're absolutely right with this idea that, neutrality can give a false sense of security, and I think that's a particularly important discussion to have here in Austria. So again, I just keep saying this, but I really am very grateful that you've come to actually talk about these important issues, because I think they're really complicated, and you need to think about them.
Okay, I'll take 2 questions quickly and short. So one there and then one over there. And do introduce yourself, please.
Alexander Andreev, I'm a journalist working with the Deutsche Welle.
Deutsche Welle, okay.
How about the promises made 1990 in the back chambers, the famous...
Not 1 inch.
Yeah, the conversation between James Baker and Eduard Shevardnadze and the famous notes with the promises the United States supposedly made. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, and over there, final question.
Hello, Ralf Janik, I teach international law in Vienna at the University of the Bundeswehr in Munich. My question concerns the promises. Isn't it somewhat misleading to focus or even obsessively focus on the question whether there had been a promise? In other words, if there had been one, couldn't some interpret this as, okay, that would have been a justification? Or in other words, in one sentence, my question, what if there had indeed been an explicit agreement not to expand? Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to expand this session by another 3 hours, right? Everybody, hopefully you're sitting comfortably?
I'll give you 2.
Because, I mean, we're literally at time right now, and those are 2 huge questions. So I will basically try to gallop through an answer, but I can only say that I really go into this in detail in the book. So for context, the whole debate over this question is whether or not there was a betrayal, right? And if you imagine a spectrum, on one end is the hardline American view. It never came up. It's a myth. The Russians are crazy. And on the other hand is the really hardline Russian view. We were absolutely betrayed, 100%, no doubt about it. And I can tell you, as someone who's looked at this on the basis of 2 decades of getting documents declassified, that neither of those are accurate. Right? As is so often the case, what happened, the narrative of events shows that what happened was somewhere in between. And so the question is where? And I think it is justified to focus on this question because it is, one of the factors that drove the disintegration in relations between the US and Russia, which I think is the great tragedy of our age, right? And again, because they are the two countries that control 90% of the nuclear warheads in the world. And if they are at odds with each other, and there are threats of nuclear war, as there are again, that would be the end of civilization on our planet. I don't think there is anything more important than that. That's why I work on it. So given that this is such an issue of conflict, this is one of the justifications Putin is using for the massive bloodshed in Ukraine, I think it's important to understand as a scholar, based on evidence, what happened. That's why it was so important to me that it be reproducible, right? So if you go back to the spectrum where you have, at one hand, you have the Americans saying it never came up, a total myth, and you have the Russians saying it, it was absolutely betrayal, and you realize neither of those work. So this would happen to me. I would do interviews. So I would press Americans and say, well, that's not accurate. I have all these documents where James Baker is saying to Mikhail Gorbachev, how about we talk about NATO not enlarging 1 inch eastward? For context, this is happening as part of German unification. And the reason this is happening is that even though the Soviet Union is weak and falling apart, with regard to divided Germany, it has two strong cards. It has nearly 400,000 troops in East Germany, and it has unlimited, unconditional legal rights over Germany coming out of World War II. When Nazi Germany surrendered in 1945, it surrendered unconditionally. Bedingungslose Kapitulation. No endline, no deadline, no nothing. So in order for Germany to unify, Moscow has to be convinced to give up both its troops and its undisputed legal rights. And so the question is, what will Moscow want in exchange? And so speculatively, and this goes to your point, Alexander of Deutsche Welle, at one point speculatively, Baker says to, as an early negotiation round, where you're, ein Sondierungsgespräch, where you're just trying to figure out positions. Baker says, well, how about this? How about we talk about maybe saying NATO won't move 1 inch eastward in exchange for you letting Germany unify? And Gorbachev says, yes, we could work on that. Baker goes back home to his boss and friend, George H.W. Bush, and Bush says, Jim, that was a mistake. We don't need to argue about the future of NATO. I'm George H.W. Bush. As I say about myself, I don't do the vision thing, right? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. I, President Bush, think that NATO just won the Cold War. Why, for God's sake, should I negotiate about its future? We're not going to do that. You need to cut this off. So Baker, this is one of my archival discoveries, Baker wrote back to the German Foreign Ministry and said, I'm very sorry, we need to stop talking about this. I've caused confusion. This is not actually our negotiating position. It took Moscow a while to notice, and the West German Foreign Minister, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, ignored this letter and kept talking about it, because he thought it, it was going to be necessary. So clearly it came up, but it was a confused moment, and then the West stepped back from that. There was also discussion early on about Central and Eastern Europe. So if you take these two extremes, it's clear it came up, it's clear it was discussed, but it got brushed aside. And then what happens at the end in the treaty is that instead of giving up its rights for promises about NATO, Moscow gives up its rights with regard to Germany for cash. The treaty does not prohibit NATO expansion. There is no, I don't like the word promise because that's a psychological term. Different people can understand different things in it. When you look at the treaty allows NATO to move eastward, and to repeat, Moscow signed and ratified this treaty and cashed the associated check. Now, the Russian position is, if you can, obviously I can't go to Russia anymore, but when I used to go there and I would talk to Russians, I would say, okay, this is not accurate, that you were totally betrayed, this treaty exists. And they would say, sort of privately, okay, you have a point. But James Baker, the best friend of the president, looked Mikhail Gorbachev in the eye and talked about NATO moving not 1 inch eastward. So that's kind of a gentleman's agreement. That is consistent with the evidence, right? So these two statements are consistent with evidence. The conversation took place, but what is in the treaty is different. And where I ultimately came down as a scholar is that what is in the treaty that matters, right? This was not a case of somebody forgetting to write something down. This was the big time, right? This was the end of the division of Germany, the end of the Cold War, in a certain sense, the end of the Second World War, right? The stakes could not have been higher. The people involved in this were pros. The Soviet diplomats were pros. James Baker was a pro. This was the biggest of big times. And, it was really a hard negotiation, and what matters is what's in the treaty. And the treaty, black and white, allows NATO to enlarge. So that was the 5-minute summary of the entire book.
Mary, that's fantastic. Well, first of all, thank you for your laborious effort. As you said, we now have a groundstone from which people can work. Maybe they can learn on the hows, not on when and if. The fact of the matter is that today we are in the 18th month of war.
Tragically, yes.
It is an unprovoked invasion by a nuclear power of a sovereign European state of 41 million people. Now probably 31 with all the refugees, but let's not go there. And the fact of the matter is that we have the biggest war on European soil after, unfortunately, my country, Yugoslavia, imploded in a war. And we have no end in sight. That is the reality on the ground. This is something that can inform us on the way that we did or did not get there. But the fact of the matter is that Russia has, unfortunately, and as you mentioned rightly, the attack on the parliament with tanks by Yeltsin, the Chechen war, and the subsequent Georgian invasion, the invasion of Georgia, the invasion and annexation of Crimea, not to mention the Hungary and Czechoslovakia before that. So there is a history there that unfortunately is repeating itself in the worst way. And I'd thus like to thank you very much, Mary Sarotte, for coming to Vienna and being with us. And thank you for asking the question, and apologies to those who didn't.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Bravo.